Welcome back for a new vlog, and excuse not the best writing, but thought let's go down memory lane, check out what I have pulled from Retro Packs 1 and 2. I ended up opening a bunch more Retro Pack 2 alpha camera. In total, equal to what I opened, so in total, opened 40 packs of Retro Pack 2, and I don't remember on Retro Pack 1. Still don't have a lot of it, but I figured let's just go down and a bit look back at history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Of course, some stuff I have a lot of, others I don't. For Retro Pack 1, starting out, I was happy when I actually did pull a reprint, of course, of Blue Eyes White Dragon All-Time Classic. Opened and got a lot of Flame Swordsmans, as well as pulled, I believe I pulled only one Dark Magician, I want to say. Or I take it back, actually pulled two. Also, Guy of the Fierce Knight, Trap Hole, which is an all-time classic, Rengeki, which is definitely a magic card that was pretty powerful, destroying all monsters your opponent controls. So definitely kind of OP. Also, music in the background is Old Town from Gravity Rush. Of course, open a bunch. Got a lot of Trap Holes. Polymerization, All-Time Classic Curse of Dragon, Giant Soldier of Stone from the OG era. Honestly, I really do have a heavy amount of nostalgia for these cards specifically. I know there's quite a few of these that are obviously today banned in the OCG and TCG. But one thing I like about knowing a couple of people who, like me, collect older, mostly prefer collecting the older Yu-Gi-Oh cards. I am actually in the near future planning on trying to show on camera and stuff. I'm thinking about rebuilding one of my old original decks, building one that would be like in Go format or an old school one, which may include a couple of cards that are banned in the official tournaments, but you know, I'm not playing a official tournament, so strictly build a deck. Specifically, I'm thinking about building one of my old decks I used to play with back in the early 2000s, a Gravekeeper deck. With that said, I also pulled multiple sorts of Revealing Light, Armed Ninja, another classic. Some of your earliest special effect monsters, Maneater, Bug, Hang, of course, Monster Reborn. All the pieces of Exodia. I'm actually surprised at how many copies of Gagarian I pulled. Summon Skull, which in the early days of the TCG and stuff metagame, Summon Skull was arguably basically treated as one of the top cards, as it was the most powerful one single sacrifice summon monster. Equal power to Dark Magician, but only required one summon rather than two. Of course, things like Harpy's Lady, Classic, Harpy Lady's Sisters, Mask of Darkness, which was a pretty cool special effect monster at the time when it originally came out. Of course, Elegant Egotist, if you're playing with that. Pieces, another one, probably the most powerful cards back in the early days, back in Metal Raiders specifically. Magician of Faith was one of the big, more beloved cards from this era specifically. Now later on, thanks to a special scientist card, Catapult Turtle would become a very popular card to use in a specific style strategy, which I believe was around like 2004-2005 time frame. Of course, many of your favorites from the actual show, stuff like Jiroi, Gumo. Cannon Soldier was definitely a pretty decent card, as you could tribute one monster and then inflict 500 points of damage directly to your opponent was a nice little ability to have. Of course, also with the show, you had stuff like Gazelle, the King of Mythical Beasts. One of my personal favorite machines of the earlier era. Barrel Dragon was definitely a bit overpowered, but then you would see some of the most powerful cards in the future, some of the future most beloved cards. At first wasn't quite as huge, specifically Solomon Judgment. Was not a big hit right at the start. Actually, cards like Magical Jammer were more popular at the time. Heavy Storm was a really big one of this era. Seven Tools the Bandit was another one that would come out earlier on from Metal Raiders, popularity-wise. Solomon Judgment would be one that would actually catch on later in the game. But Heavy Storm was a pretty OP, as people had to worry about their secondary basically being destroyed using Heavy Storm. Then you would see later on stuff like the Toon Monsters, which really aren't that great overall. In the game, yeah, they seem great, but when you actually look at effects on a lot of Toon stuff, it's not that great, really. There were some pretty cool cards at this time. I mean, one of my all-time favorites was probably Black Pendant, in all honesty. Then another one of the all-time classics of this era, Mahavilo, which would be one that would be a little bit more used later on in the game. Of course, Gravekeeper's Servant was a pretty cool continuous magic card. Upstart Goblin would be something that would be more experimented with a little bit later in the game. Of course, Relinquish was one of my all-time favorite cards from the show, as well as in general. It was a very useful card, as you could use super weak stuff in order to ritual summon Relinquish, and his effect made him more than worth having on the field. I mean, you also had other all-time classic cards like of this era, like Mythical Space Typhoon was a really good magic card of this time. Giant Trune was one of my personal favorites, even if it wasn't quite as popular in the meta of the game and stuff. Now, Painful Choice would be another one that would really catch on huge, definitely, earlier on than others. And Megamorph was also a very useful, I think, magic equip card. Depending on your playstyle, really, though, to how useful these cards would be. Of course, more Toon Monsters, one of the first dragons I would ever have, and an old school dragon deck from years ago. UFO Turtle was an interesting one. Giant Rat wasn't really that great compared to other special effect monsters. Honestly, Giant Germ was more useful, I think. Also, I'll say, of this era, arguably out of these special effect monsters, I would argue Mystic Tomato was probably the best. It didn't catch on as quick as some of the other special effect cards at the time. Mystic Tomato would become more popular later on, plus it would even be adapted in like Chaos decks, which arguably when Chaos first came out, thanks to Invasion of Chaos, specifically Chaos Emperor Dragon, as well as, of course, Chaos Knight, basically all but almost completely broke the metagame and would dominate for a very long time until the ban lists and limited lists would update. Of course, you had a lot of field match cards from this time. Another one, probably the best earlier on special effect monsters you could have played in the game, was Wall of Illusion. With its effect, the fact it had 1850 defense made it great defense monster of the time period. And the fact it's basically a monster that attacks this card, return to its owner's hand, damage calculation damage, basically done normal. Arguably for the longest time though, when it came to power of non-sacrifice monsters, basically La Jinn, Genie of the Lamp, was the most popular card. You had like a Mechanical Chaser, but that was like a $200 card. Originally exclusively in like Tournament Pack 1, which was basically the only good card from Tournament Pack 1. Of course, one of my all-time favorites from a old Dragon deck, being of course Lord of D with Flutus Summoning Dragon. And this would be the last of what I have of Retro Pack 1. With Flutus Summoning Dragon, one of the most broken cards. Reason people like myself bought originally the Pegasus starter deck was mostly for graceful charity. One of the reasons to get originally the Joey was for the Scapegoat card. At the time, people didn't know as much how to use Scapegoat, but as a quick play Magic card, it was great. Graceful Charity was a great card as well, which almost broke the game, honestly. It was just as powerful as, well, obviously, Pot of Greed, which eventually people knew would be broken. Looking at what I have so far for Retro Pack 2, Jinzo, I've now pulled 2 copies of Jinzo. Jinzo was a card which originally all but broke the game. It was probably one of the most sought after cards easily from the set Pharaoh Servant, which is in my, probably like my 3rd favorite set of all time from Yu-Gi-Oh! I really love Pharaoh Servant set. Had some incredible cards. Lake Forest Soar was a great trap card of the time period to use in games. Dust Tornado was more so. Call of the Haunted was another superb, great trap card to come from this era. Very powerful, very useful in different types of decks. A great way to also revive cards. The best way to play Jinzo was basically just sacrifice it and then use Monster Reborn or another revival card just to bring Jinzo back. And the fact he could destroy all trap cards basically made him very OP, and was great in things like the few specific styles of decks at the time period, like Beatdown. He was very useful in. Other greats, probably one of my all-time favorite Magic cards, also from Pharaoh Servant, that being, of course, the all-time great Premature Burial, which is very useful to have beside. And the fact that it's an equip card also is really cool. But Premature Burial is very useful, just like Monster Reborn. Very OP, depending on how you played it, but there's a reason why I think me and others have very high amount of positive memories for this. Magical Hats was more of a so-so. Then you have Buster Blader, an all-time classic from the show, though I would argue cards like, in the actual game, Skull Invitation was a great continuous trap card of the time period. Honestly, I miss this era. I mean, each time a card is sent to the graveyard, inflict 300 damage to its owner for each card sent. So say you use, I don't know, say you use something to destroy cards, like say somebody attacks you, you use Mirror Force or something, and it destroys multiple cards, and if you have Skull Invitation, I mean, you could be talking like 12 to 1500 damage right there. I mean, depending on how you use it, Skull Invitation was a card that could destroy your opponent's life points very easily. But unfortunately, it could also be used against you at the same time. So you definitely have to have a strategy that revolves around the abilities of Skull Invitation. Limiter Removal was another really cool card of the time. Now, I will say, I don't know anybody ever used specific cards like this. I didn't know anyone that really played with, like, insect decks or anything. Magic Drain was another all-time classic trap card of this period. Gravity Bind was interesting, but I never knew anybody who personally used it. Another great card from this time would be Thousand Eyes Restrict. Had a very useful ability. Now, 4-star Ladybug of Doom was an interesting flip thing. Basically, destroy all level 4 monsters your opponent controls. So, if your monster relies on specific level 4 cards or something, this is a good way to get back at them. Though not a lot of people used that card. Mad Sword Beast was another interesting card of the time, with its ability. Though I would say, of earlier decks I ever used from this time period, Goblin Attack Force was a card that I had multiples of, like 3 of in a deck. Specifically a old school like beatdown deck. Though I wouldn't use very long. I would eventually come into experimenting more with a specific like type of creature. My first real experiment with that was like Dragon. Then later on Gravekeeper, which would be one I would experiment, try, test, and use for about probably 2 years or so. Would end up being my personal favorite deck I ever built theme-wise. Which is why I'd kind of like to see if I could get the cards and try to rebuild an old Grave Keeper deck. Maybe build like a 40 card deck or something. Gemini Elf, when this came out, definitely one of the OP cards, as it was a level 4 with 1900 attacks, so 100 more than La Jin and others. Made it very useful. You had, of course, special effect stuff I never really saw anybody ever use. Cards like Revival Jam. The Mass Beast was a pretty cool card. I preferred, like, Discardius specifically. But of this time period, there was some really cool stuff also. The masks were really fun to experiment with of this time frame. Mask of Restrict was fun. Mask of Despair. Many really cool, unique mask cards. Tornado Wall is one I never really saw too many people use. Now, Torrential Tribute was a very broken card. Very good reason why it was used. And depending on strategies, cards like Infinite cards could be useful. Card of Safe Return was another very useful magic card. Gem Defender, not so much. Never really saw anybody use that stuff now. Then we came with another deck at one time I would experiment and try out. Try building a Spirit deck with cards like Kaiku, which was a legit really OP gray card, but Soul Eater, this card right here, was broken to all hell. I mean, you could do some serious damage with cards like this. Use a bunch of different spirit cards together with a theme. You had some really good stuff. Of course, in my top 10 favorite like monster designs of all time is Dark Necrofear. So definitely made me happy the fact I did end up pulling Dark Necrofear in Retro Pack 2. Some other interesting cards that would eventually be like limited and stuff. A Interesting Dinosaur, another one of my all-time favorite cards. I actually did use one of in my Gravekeeper deck. Dark Spirit of the Silent is an all-time classic. Of course, you have the Destiny board. So far, I have at least 2 full Destiny board sets now of cards thanks to this, because I've only pulled 2 copies of our Destiny board. All the letters. Magic Cylinder was one that would see some experimentation. Of course, basically the top most important card of my old Spirit deck that I played with, Yato Garasu, was a big one. Having 3 copies of that in my deck before, of course, it got put on the limited list. Down to 1. If you had 3 copies of Yatagarasu, you could do some serious damage and just basically annoy the crap out of your opponent. Another very useful card for certain circumstances was Emergency Provisions. Was a really cool one. This was an interesting card, but it had to be played a specific way in a certain type of deck. Some of the other really cool spirit cards that I'm glad to see. This one, which was of course a dragon card, but didn't use in my dragon, using this. Some of your other really cool spirit cards of the time. Of course, Bottomless Trap Hole was a great trap card of the time period. Creature Swap was another one that would be used. I remember specifically this card was used in different types of Chaos decks. Then you would have one other interesting card that I would see in Spirit decks. This one would do some serious damage. Of course, you have a special book traps. You have Reckless Greed, which never really saw anybody use. Dark Cherry was a cool card. Then we see some of my dear Gravekeepers. I would usually use about 3 copies of the basic Gravekeeper cards. Like, the 3 here would be 3 of them that I would use in my Gravekeeper deck. Gravekeeper Chief is pretty cool. Then, of course, there was one specific Gravekeeper card that I love to death. Was one of the flagship cards of my deck. As well as one of the most important things also in the Gravekeeper deck was this fill card. As it would power up and let your Gravekeeper monsters gain 500 attack and defense points, which was one reason. Dark Room of Nightmare could also be used in a Gravekeeper strategy. Now, Barrel Behind the Door. Never really saw anybody ever use this card. Now, a few of the others, of course, Nightmare Wheel was a really cool one. Lava Golem was interesting. Royal Decree was quite useful. Obnoxious Kilting Guardian, never really saw anybody play, but by this time I wasn't playing as much at the time. Insect Queen is an old-time classic. So far I've pulled 2 of the 4 Magnet Warriors, and this is the 2 Starlights that I pulled. This one I pulled on camera, this one I pulled off of camera, which honestly is legit really cool. The fact I pulled one of the most sought after cards from the retro pack. Too bad this wasn't the one I pulled on camera, but this card alone basically pays for, in value, almost all the boxes I've purchased. So for Retro Pack 2, this basically justified the cost on its own. Let alone the fact I actually ended up pulling 2 Starlights is pretty awesome. But I love the fact now I have Dragon Master Knight. So with that said, that's just a little going down memory lane with me. Looking back at the early days and stuff. But with that said, I'll see y'all next time, and stay safe out there.